Actually hear it. Yes? Okay.
There you go.
Now for sure. Got it. Thank you. So we're going to start the third panel. It's going to be very different from the first two. No contributing authors on this panel. Instead, it is going to focus on more practical solutions, politics, all of that involved in this conversation. So you also see that we have an empty seat here. The empty seat is for Jim Blue. He's the Assistant Secretary for Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development at the U.S. Department of Education. He is currently en route with Secretary DeVos, so he is doing his best to get here. He will likely arrive towards the end of it, but enough time to ask him some questions, and for the audience, once we do the Q&A, to ask him too. But he will be a valuable contributor regardless of when he gets here. So I'm going to lead a longer talk with them, and then for the end, we'll again do the Q&A for the same amount of time that we did for the first two panels. So from my right on, Joanne Weiss. She's an independent consultant to organizations for education programs, technology, and policies. For the past 15 years, she's focused on driving systems.
Driving something? Cars.
Systems level education change, yes. Driving cars also. Through high impact grant making, investing, and policy making. And interestingly, from 2009 to 2013, she worked in the Obama administration as chief of staff for Secretary Duncan. And she was director of the Federal Race to the Top program. Next to her, Gerard Robinson. He is currently the executive director of the Center for Advancing Opportunity. He works with historically black colleges and universities and other post-secondary institutions, working primarily with issues regarding fragile families. Before that, he was a resident scholar here at AEI, where he remains as an adjunct fellow. But he's also worked in roles. He was the Commissioner of Education for the state of Florida under Governor Rick Scott, and he was actually the Secretary of Education for Virginia, and before that, President of the Black Alliance for Educational Options. Sorry, that's a lot. And next to him is Daarel Burnette. Daarel is a staff writer for Education Week, and previously he's covered beats for Chalkbeat Tennessee, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Minneapolis Star-Tribune, and the Louisville Courier-Journal. So a nice sort of mix of experiences, perspectives, to sort of shed some good light on what we talked about on the first two panels. So actually all three of you were here for the first two. So I'm just going to sort of go down and just generally ask you sort of what jumped out as maybe the most interesting bit or the sort of greatest opportunity for actual change on the ground in terms of getting this conversation to happen more often and more fruitfully about stretching the school dollars. So Joanne, start with you.
Okay, what jumped out at me isn't necessarily the same as what I think is going to be the easiest to change.
Sure.
Which,
okay.
Of course, is always the conundrum that we have in education. It's
correct.
kind of like when you said we're going to have a conversation that's practical and about politics. And I was like, are we now? Okay, so I certainly think that all of the charts that Brian Hassel showed about teacher salaries being flat basically since 1970 in the face of the actual per pupil expenditures rising is very telling. I sort of coupled that with Nate Levinson's point about step one being moral outrage, and it's pretty easy to see how moral outrage by teachers around their salaries is taking center stage politically right now. I think a lot of those dots connect pretty clearly. The thing is that I'm not sure they connect to what we should actually be doing to solve these problems. To Marguerite's point, the the expenditures and the variations in expenditures don't really explain the variations in performance. And so just raising teacher salaries is clearly not the solution to the problems that we have around equity and academic performance. And we need a much more nuanced conversation than we are clearly having around this right now in order to really address the problems that face us.
Gerard.
So first of all, it's good to be here again. I want to thank Rick and Mike for the invitation. So panel one was really interesting because we're talking about the path forward and where we go. And there's no conversations that's going to go forward without talking about teachers, but also staff, because they're the ones where a lot of money is being invested. And I think everyone did a really good job of explaining a different aspect of it. Panel two was equally good in part because they discussed the importance of how do we think about money, whether it's through entrepreneurship, there's the technology and those kinds of points. You know, when I think about politics, I think that the path forward is often shaped by the contours of the roads that we plowed before. And so when I'm hearing the conversations today, it takes me back to 1983 for two reasons. First, I think of a nation at risk. Bang for the buck, while that term wasn't used then, that was really a conversation about bang for the buck. What also took place in 1983, there was a very famous song by the heavy metal group Quiet Riot called Mental Health. And there was a segment in there where they said, bang your head, now, now, now. Mental health will drive you mad. Let me put this in perspective. When you talk to Jack and Jill's mother in 1983, or Sienna and Ray Ray's mama in 1983, and everyone in between, all of them said bang for the buck makes sense. But when they ask questions about school spending, how much is my kid getting? How much are we paying teachers? By the time the educators and others explained the answers, their mothers and dads were banging their heads. Like, what? School finance is driving me mad. Either mad like, oh, I don't understand, or mad like, just get to the point. So as we fast forward to today and ahead, I think the best thing that we can do to add to the conversation is one phrase, layperson literacy. We've got to make sure the average taxpayer in cities, districts understand how we do it, and I'll talk more about that later.
Yes. So I think what popped out to me most is Adam's comment about the fact that researchers have concluded that money does matter. And I will kind of call out my fellow colleagues, both the press and Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos constantly tell the general public that money does not matter. And so there's this gap between what the research community is saying, what practitioners are saying, and what the press and the Secretary of Education is saying. And I think that considering the fact that there is a shift going on right now, a shift from the focus on outputs, accountability, test scores, et cetera, to inputs, what actually goes into the system, and money, considering the teacher strikes from last year, it's going to become more and more incumbent upon us to sort of like, for the press especially, to start getting into the weeds as to why money matters, and then also for researchers to start looking at exactly where money actually makes most sense. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. I'm glad you guys are actually doing this. I mean, I convinced my editors probably stupidly about 4 months ago to switch my beat to school finance, full time. So, so I'm writing about this. I'm learning that it's very confusing, but also there are just a lot of stories that just have not been covered.
And yeah, so that's actually, I think, a good segue. You obviously are a unique voice here on this panel as a reporter covering this beat. You said there's a lot of stories not being covered. So what in your 4 months on this beat has sort of jumped out in terms of the biggest example of that?
I think oftentimes one of the things that I find to be really fascinating about school finance is that the lack of data. So it's not very good data and it's very outdated data. So what we actually know about how schools spend their money is just so opaque. And so, when I used to cover school districts, you would get the spokesperson saying it's just too confusing, don't worry about it, or money doesn't matter, and districts were really cagey about their budgets. You don't really understand some of the things that they were talking about up here about staffing models, about school construction, et cetera. Reporters actually just could never engage in these sorts of issues because school districts are just so defensive of this. And I'm learning it's because oftentimes policymakers and school districts actually don't know where the money is going. And so this movement to more transparency and more clear and more up-to-date data, I think that's going to help out just the general public in general, especially practitioners, but the press especially, and just trying to move that conversation forward.
And part of what he's talking about is that in December, systems are going to have to start making public school-level expenditures, including what comes from state, local, and federal dollars. That'll be the first time that's ever been required. Before, it used to be district expenditures, and which I think actually is a good segue to your experience at the department. Clearly, this is a new regulation based on ESSA. Was there talk of this when you were in the department? What was your thinking?
No, absolutely. I mean, ESSA was passed in the Obama administration. So yes, there was a lot of talk about this. And I think that the question of how much are you really spending in your building was completely opaque to most principals. So they were managing a tiny, tiny, tiny sliver of discretionary spending instead of having any kind of understanding, much less say, over what was happening in their building. And the thought was that at least getting transparent about it, having some standard practices for how you report this, and then getting transparent about what was going on was the first step. I think it's very much just a first step because the information that comes out is going to be very confusing to people, and we're really going to need people like Daarel to make sense of it to people, and people like Marguerite Rosa and her group to actually train principals in what to do with this information, or it's going to just be some information that's buried in the, 10 layers down in the internet someplace and nobody will care about it. So one quick example, most schools today get an allocation for every teacher that's standard across the entire district. They're not actually paying for the people in their building and the different salaries that their people have, right? So it's just normalized across the district. In this new rule, they have to account for the actual salaries that are happening in their building. And one thing that we know is that low-income schools often have the newest teachers who are therefore paid the lower salaries, and therefore the per-pupil expenditure actually on kids in low-income schools is much lower than it is in the same district on schools in higher-income neighborhoods. So we know this to be true. We are about to see it in the data. What does it mean, though? What the heck do we do about it? That's going to be the conversation that we need to have, and the answers are actually not that clear and easy. We're going to start shuffling teachers around against their will, or what are we going to do?
Mm-hmm. And Gerard, in your roles in Florida and Virginia, was this sort of lack of knowledge? Well, first, was the school level spending opaque? Or unknown to you and others in your state level roles? And if it was that frustrating? Was it something that you tried to address? Was it something that ever came up as trying to pass any sort of state rules in terms of more transparency at the school level?
So in each state, I worked for a newly elected governor, someone who had actually run for office on a school reform pattern. So one of the advantages of going in with a new governor is that he or she, in my case it was two guys, but he or she knows a great deal more about school finance and what they want to do. So that issue was on people's, plate in a real way. You say you're going to do this, let's do that. So I think the data was there. I also don't buy into the fact that we don't really have good information. If you don't believe so, call the school finance lawyers who sue school districts and state. Somehow they seem to find all the information they need to sue us. And I've actually, in my legal capacity, been sued. We won the lawsuit. But they seem to find the information. Number two, I knew exactly how much we allocated to each student in Florida because it was a straight line. How many people in here are from Virginia? Okay, how many of you know about the composite index? Okay, and the composite index is how we fund school systems. If you're poor, state will give you more. If you're rich, it's less. That was a tougher conversation to have because it varied across school systems. So for me, it goes back to making sure that we get regular people, many of them who have no children in the school system because they're grown and they don't have any children. So I think data is more available. I just think we at the state level, Department of Ed, need to do a better job of articulating that to families. And one thing that I did is I went on a robocall where I was in over 100,000 homes with my voice saying X, Y, and Z, this is what we're doing, blah, blah, blah. We've got to do much more what I call the soul to soul, taking what you believe in here and walking the walk.
Great. To switch gears a tiny bit, more to politics now. We've obviously talked a lot about, right, how you spend the dollars you have is important. But the focus, at least on the Democratic side in debates, for example, has been mostly about spending more, increasing the funding for schools. So sort of in that environment, is there room in the discourse about sort of spending money better or changing what the targets are in addition to spending, or in addition to increasing the levels of funding? So Daarel, based on your work?
Well, the teacher reporter and I, last 2 years, we've been writing a lot about the teacher strikes. And one of the most fascinating things that we found was that there were so many governors who were trying to give teacher raises and realizing, a lot of new governors realizing that they actually don't have the power to directly give teachers raise. This is a confusion amongst the general public, it's a confusion amongst teachers. A lot of the rallies you'll see, sometimes this happened in Sacramento where the teachers are going back and forth between the Capitol building and their district headquarters. There is no idea as to who actually is in charge of actually giving teachers raises. And so what I think we're going to see a lot of this year is that governors ended up just giving a lot of money to districts and saying, please raise your teacher pay. And in Florida's example, where the governor would say, please give this to the teachers in which they're working with the most struggling students. And so this is going to all go onto the bargaining table. There's going to be a lot of infighting within districts. You saw us in Arizona where the governor said 20% raise by 2020. There were some teachers that got 5% raises. There were some teachers that got 1% raises. Some teachers that got no raises. There were some teachers that got 30% raises, 40% raises. So it's just really uneven. This kind of goes back to when I covered state politics. In education, nobody actually knows who's in charge. And I think this is even more true with school funding.
And with your time in the department, Joanne, obviously you guys led a lot of reforms, right? You were reformers. And sometimes the policies and the programs that you put in place were controversial with certain people in your Democratic base. So how did you sort of deal with the discrepancy in sort of the public conversation, and what sort of what recommendations would you have for candidates now who might want to talk about spending money better as opposed to just spending more?
I mean, we came in at the beginning of the Great Recession, so it was a very different time. It was much more a time like Karen Hawley-Miles was talking about, with declining revenue, not so much declining enrollment, but hugely declining revenue. And the idea was, how do you use this opportunity to spark people to rethink the way they're spending money in their districts? You can see how well that worked, because we're still sitting here having the same conversation. So I actually feel a little bit at wit's end around how to spark these kinds of conversations. I think it's very easy to talk about increasing teacher salaries. It's politically a winning message for the Democrats, and it's true. Teachers are gigantically underpaid for the level of education they have and for the level of contribution they make to the future of this country. All of that is true, and yet that is not, and we all know it, that is not nearly enough, and that does not get to the root cause, really, of a lot of the problems that we have in this country. And so I don't think they're actually problems that politicians are going to solve. I think most of the solutions that you heard up here were very local solutions. And the question that and I think that's right. I think these are local solutions. The question, I think, for policymakers is, what is it you can do to bring those to scale, or to use your power to leverage the local conversations to happen in the right kinds of ways. And so those, I think, are some of the things that states need to be thinking about in the future. I'm not sure that any of this is going to play out on the federal scene in this. I'm sure it's not going to play out on the federal scene for this next election. That's clearly not the issue that's at the top of mind for voters. It is going to be a big state question.
And so we've talked now a little bit about the left. Gerard, you've obviously worked on the right. So what's been your observations in terms of any difficulties in sort of passing Republican-friendly reforms and policies, and how the Republican base has sort of interacted with those efforts?
So when we have a discussion about school finance, it's often a one-sided discussion. Revenue. It's a two-sided ledger. Let's also talk about expenses. If you want to spend more money on teachers, great. But there's opportunity costs, and there are going to be trade-offs. And we often don't discuss the expenditure side. Sometimes Republicans spend too much time on expenditures. We're spending too much, not enough, da-da-da. I think we need to have a revenue expenditure discussion. I think that's one thing we can do. Number two, by making this a conversation about taxpayers and not a conversation about schools, it broadens the conversation to include what I would call the wealth of cities. This is really, I think on the first panel, someone talked about talking about schools and teachers as talent, and saying that you are going to pay into your system whether you have children or not. And your city is going to be smarter. When you look at the smartest cities in the country, and they rank them every year, there's always a correlation between the number of people over the age of 25 with a bachelor's degree or higher, also location of superintendents, number of people with jobs. So by making it a taxpayer conversation, it broadens to say this school is a part of our city, our community. When we talk revenue, we talk expenses because we pay into it. I think some Republicans have done it better than others over time. But by doing that, it makes the conversation humane and not the bang your head kind of conversation.
Makes sense. And to sort of stay on this issue and sort of go towards the sort of increasing divides in our country between the left and the right, at least on certain issues. Daarel, on sort of school issues, what's been your observation in your work, but sort of talking to the public and talking to people on both sides? Have you had any interesting insights? Or where has it gotten worse? Where has it gotten better? To sort of ask a more specific.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, you had mentioned the Democratic debate. I think one of the things about education policy is that it's becoming, while education politics is very local, it's becoming more of a nationalized conversation. So the sorts of it's becoming more polarized, but there's also, it's become more polarized, but it's also reached a crescendo in that it's a debate at the presidential elections, which I don't think we would have ever thought. I mean, when I got into education reporting, I mean, nobody knew who the Secretary of Education was, and now, the department is. I think we just wrote a story last week. The department is a little least hated than ICE. So, I think that there is a lot of opportunity. I mean, one of the things that's fascinating about the teacher strikes is that this was an opportunity, I think Marguerite talks a lot about this, for politicians, policymakers, researchers, practitioners to explain to the public why spending has gone up so much. That a lot of the spending does not go into teacher pay. To talk about the more complicated issues such as pensions and healthcare, which is really sacking districts with a lot of costs fixed costs that they just cannot get out of. School construction, which is one of the most regressive sorts of funding mechanisms that we have in our government, it's at a crisis point. I mean, if you've talked to districts, and they will talk about the leaking roofs, et cetera. Like they are literally shutting down schools. They're closing schools because the schools don't have heat, they don't have air conditioning, et cetera. And this school funding is locally driven. It's a locally driven revenue. I think it's 80% comes out of local funds. Same with pensions. So I think there are a lot of discussions that needs to have airing out. The press needs to cover it. The politicians need to sort of bring people to the table together for this sort of thing. So opportunity, I would say.
Makes sense. Yeah, so a couple times now it's come up, right, sort of how public opinion influences and is also influenced. And when you look at polls, you actually see some strange or, I guess, complicated information. For example, Education Next generally asks the public whether they support funding increases. And generally the answer is yes. But then when you tell them how much is actually already being spent, then the public tends to split, and Republicans are generally against it. Likewise, when you tell them how much funding actually comes from the state or a local source versus the federal government, then they generally oppose non-federal funding increases. On top of that, right, you have PDK just found for the 18th year in a row that the public perceives a lack of financial support as the biggest problem facing schools. And at the same time, the public is generally opposed to increases in taxation. So how do you sort of square these things? How do you I guess, sort of educate the public and so that they can have sort of an informed conversation? And then once that happens, to what level do you engage the public in the making of decisions? So I guess since you've worked at the state level, how do you do this? And thank you, Jim, for
Thank you for
joining
letting me
us.
sneak in.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
Oh, they got a ton of questions for you.
We saved him up.
So at the state level, it's really spending time with your superintendents, making sure you provide them with as much information as you can on what the state is providing so that they can make a distinction between what the local is giving, state and federal. To be honest, some superintendents would hide behind the fact that they did not increase the teacher pay, and they say it's because Gerard didn't give me the money to do so. I didn't hire your teacher. I don't fire your teacher, and I don't give them raises. And so making sure they had the state level, but also seeing where the games come in. Number two, in my current role at the center, we're at Thurgood Marshall College Fund. We partnered with Gallup. We interviewed 5,784 people in 47 states focused on education, criminal justice, and entrepreneurship. Guess what in education? One of the big issues, we need more money for schools. It confirms Phi Delta Kappa, Ed Choice, Education Next. So I just think we need to spend more time taking that information, which is why this conference is good, because you have really smart people writing chapters that will make me literate. I can then take that in the role that I have working with people on the ground level and have the conversation with them. But it's got to be a soul-to-soul approach.
And in your consulting work, now that you've left the department, you tend to work on more of a state and a local. What has been your insights and comparable to what you just spoke about? How do you think state and local leaders can do this better? Do you have anything else or anything different than what Gerard said?
No, I think that this information is going to help. I think a conversation that's sparked by the ESSA information being released is going to help. I think Ed Week is going to help enormously, and I think that books like this one that can help educate policymakers about what to do, what kinds of questions to ask, what works, what doesn't work, are going to be helpful tools. I think this public narrative around we want more money for our schools, we don't want to pay more in taxes, this is the world we've always lived in, that there's nothing new about this. And, very much to, I think, the point Mike McShane was making about talking to Alberto Carvalho is when you do a good job locally in your district and people see value for the money you're spending, and then you put out a bond to raise more money, people will vote for it. So people are not averse to paying more taxes. They just want to understand that there's actual value that's attached to it. And this is, for the foreseeable future, this is going to be a very local issue, as Gerard said, and it's going to be dependent on local educators being able to show value and explain how the money's being spent and why more is needed and where it's going to go.
I'll bring Jim into the conversation now to remind you. I'll just introduce you a bit. He's the Assistant Secretary for Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development at the U.S. Department of Education. But before that, he's held a number of senior roles at reform organizations like Students First and the Alliance for School Choice. But he's also worked in philanthropy at the Walton Family Foundation, running their K-12 reform investments for nearly a decade. So variety of experience. And based on those, just sort of very generally, right, this conversation is about how we can influence systems to work to get more bang for their buck, to spend whatever dollars they have, be it current or new, better and more effectively. So very sort of top level, based on your experience, what do you think is the best way to sort of facilitate this, to actually make that happen?
Great. Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for having me late. I get the irony that the Assistant Secretary for Planning shows up a half hour late. So that's a pretty huge question. As you read the papers, and I had a lot of time on airplanes in the last week, so I was able to get through most of them. You're left with a sense of, yes, Joanne, it's always been like this, where there's demand from the system for more money and resistance from the taxpayers. But that equation is changing, and I guess it was Dr. Ladner's paper, pointed out the tension between what older voters want in terms of their own health care versus the needs of the education system, which is generally a local problem. But we used to talk about guns versus butter. We're looking at hospice versus classrooms at this point, and I think we'll see a lot more pressure, downward pressure on revenue. There are the rest of the papers demonstrate we're not spending money very effectively, and I'm now suddenly thrust in a position similar to Joanne in the last administration, where I'm looking at how federal money is spent. And, first of all, I think it's important for everybody to understand how little money is coming from the federal government. And that may be a problem, but it may also be much more appropriate that local and state government pick up most of these costs. I'm sure most educators don't want Washington, D.C. telling them what to do. So we have a situation where demonstrably we're not spending the money very well. And then yet we're still saying we need more revenue, right? And so we've got to address this problem. I'm not going to get on a stage without missing the opportunity to talk about how important school choice and competition is in that venue. We have virtually every other sector of our economy has choice and competition, which improves quality and drives down costs. We know that across 400 years of research. And yet, in our system, we still, even in these papers, we assume we're not going to change that we're going to have large government monopolies trying to do better with the money that they have. So I think one thing we got to put on the table is we should be moving more and more to a system of choice and competition. And then there's a big question for what role the federal government plays, if at all. Most people in this room know we have two large programs in the K-12 space. One is Title I for disadvantaged children. When you work out the math, we're spending about $500 per disadvantaged child. Now you can talk to the school districts, they'll tell you that is really critical money. But you think about, like, every time you do $1 million, it's an extra 20 cents per child. So you do $1 billion, it's $20 per child. So you're looking at a lot of money and having to assume that there's no administrative sponge for the federal government to increase its roles. So all of that is, I see I've taken too much time here, but the takeaway is that we got to figure out a system that has a lot less friction, so that $500 actually gets to the kids, into classrooms, and hopefully just expand that. And you can imagine systems where choice and competition are the mainstay, where we wouldn't be funding things the way we are right now. And I believe that would be a lot more effective and efficient.
So from a federal role standpoint, Joanne, you're obviously on the other side of the aisle and worked.
Joanne and I agree on so many things. I wish you wouldn't position it
Oh,
that
sorry,
way.
sorry.
I'm at the other side of the panel, though.
Yes, but you definitely worked in a department that certainly played a bigger federal role. So just from this funding and budgeting side, what role do you think the federal government should and can play?
I mean, Jim is right. The numbers are the numbers. There's the federal government contributes a very small percentage of the funding. That percentage is critical, and so states do care what the feds say because that money is critical, even though it's not huge. And so I think the bully pulpit matters a lot. I think a lot of the things that we've been saying in here today are actually ideas that are not out there in the mainstream. You know, the Marguerite game of like how to think about trade-offs, Brian Hassel's opportunity culture. There's a lot of really important ideas here. The way Karen Hawley-Miles is talking about districts thinking about how to reshape their expenditures in the face of declining revenue. One thing that states and the federal government can do is consider themselves in this marketplace for ideas and put the ideas out there, share them, share the expertise, get this information out there so that people can start picking up ideas and using them more effectively. Right now, we just let people hang out there with problems and very weak solutions, and I agree that solutions are going to have to be local and community-based, but bringing data and bringing ideas to the table is a prerequisite for community engagement of the type that we're looking for, and I think the federal government has an important role to play in that.
And from a desire standpoint, Daarel, what do you see in terms of what states and districts want from the federal government? Do you see anything different from what they've said?
I
Or
do
what
think
they're doing, I
Well,
guess?
I do think that one of the things that we did for our special report is we did a survey asking a lot of districts their thoughts about managing their money and some of the struggles that they have, and there is a lot of frustration about IDEA. This is a federal policy, and the federal spending has not budged in several years. Special education costs are one of the most, I think, one of the panelists talked about this, one of the most frustrating areas. There's a lot of confusion. There's never enough money, et cetera. A lot of district administrators told me, they said, these politicians are passing legislation, they're not funding it. Pensions is one of the things. State lawmakers created pension funds, and they are not paying for them. They are not sufficiently paying for them. And with special education at the federal level, another thing is I think that there's a lot of confusion as to the general public as to how many of our kids today are ELL, special education, and qualify for free and reduced lunch. It's about half of the kids. The majority of students in K-12 are Black, Latino, and Asian. The majority are poor. There's a significantly growing number of students who are ELL, and there's a significantly number of students who require special needs. These are all costly measures, and these are kids that are in schools that are dramatically underfunded. So oftentimes we talk about the $700 billion figure. This swings, there's so much variety in this. I mean, we talk about average salaries for teachers at $60,000. In one of the papers, they talked about the average teacher pay in Cleveland was $100,000. Well, I was in Oklahoma a couple of months ago in which teachers were telling me I'm being paid $25,000. So just there's so much variety in school spending, and you see this in schools, you see this in districts, et cetera. So,
Can I just jump in with another big role the federal government plays and does not always do as well as it could is on research. Like, we just have so many open questions here. You know, Brian Hassel and I were talking at the break about coaching, and is there an effective caseload size that makes sense? Like, we just don't know so many things about the basic work that we're out there doing, and the federal government has a huge role to play in funding the right kinds of research to answer the essential questions here.
I'd like to jump in as well because it's federal, but it's also state. When we discuss school finance, we often think the fix is policy, and that's important. But we overlook the power of regulation, and here's why. Many state legislators are in session 30, 60, 90 days. They go home, except in California, full-time legislature there. But school boards meet every month for the most part, and they're making decisions as to how we're going to impact the policy and give teeth to it. I rarely see or rarely saw researchers come and testify before our state school board about the importance of what we're going to do. They would testify before the legislature for all the right reasons. The power is in the regulations. So I'd love to see that. There's a federal conversation as well, but I'd love to see more of this take place at state school board level and having conversations, because in my former life, I wish someone would have told me that when I was in my 30s.
Great. Jim, one more.
That was 2 years ago.
Direct.
Yeah.
Direct question. We talked about this earlier on the panel, how in December, for the first time, systems will have to start making public school level expenditures and saying what comes from a local, state, or federal funding source. With that going sort of into effect, how is the department thinking about this? Joanne made a good point that people will just be very confused in terms of like what these data mean and what to do with them. And anyway, so what's the department's thinking?
We hope it's a game changer. We don't think that the public or the policymakers understand the flow of money. Marguerite and others in the room are helping states catch up. The thing we're seeing is we're all going to be really disappointed at the first cut at this. There are one or two exceptions of states that are doing a good job. Most of them are trying to hide their website as far underneath as possible so nobody ever finds it, because if they look at it, they're just going to be confused. So always looking at these things as we learn as we go. We hope the next iteration will be better. We are looking ourselves at how we can, there are other groups, Marguerite, I mentioned, DQC, others who are doing a pretty good job already, helping folks understand these issues and then portraying them. We probably will be highlighting some of those and maybe shaming some of the really bad examples. But on the whole, we have to let people know. Look, there's a reason why the establishment has obfuscated where the money's going. And we believe that even reporters will want to follow when they actually see how money isn't flowing to the half of kids that generate the revenue, at least from the federal government. So.
Makes sense.
I just want to say one of the things that I found really disheartening and discouraging and bizarre when we did the surveys, we asked administrators to define equity. Their definitions were all over the place. So we're throwing this out saying we need to be more equitable, we need to be more equitable. And there is wide variation. There's no agreement amongst administrators as to what equity is. And this is going to be forefront with school spending data, because what it's going to show is that in some instances, we are spending a significantly more money on wealthy schools. In some instances, we're spending significantly more money on poor schools, and we're not getting the desired outcomes. But what does equity mean? Do we think that both those schools should be getting the same exact amount of money? And that conversation is going to be front and center for school boards, as you pointed out, who actually do approve the budget. Most school board members do not understand this. They approve the budget every year, and they're going to be asking these questions at these monthly board meetings. So I think from the federal, state, and local, there needs to be more of an agreement as to what equity actually is and what it means.
Makes sense.
Are we allowed to ask you a question?
Of course.
So why wasn't weighted student formulas and sort of the state level funding formulas and equity around those one of the issues that you took up as a big topic in the papers in this?
I think our topics were a combination of sort of what contributors were willing and able to write about, their level of expertise, availability, limited amount of space. But I do think we get more into it in a couple of the chapters that weren't represented here. One especially is how this is handled in regards to healthcare and pensions.
Chad.
And Chad, who was supposed to
Alderman
be
wrote.
on panel one, but he couldn't be. talks a lot about this, and we actually didn't get a chance to talk about that chapter or the opening one, which sort of sets the stage in terms of the graying population, which with the baby boomers entering retirement age and all of the effect that will have, especially on state level funding and expenditures. So I do think we get at it more than what was represented here on the panels, but I definitely agree that it is important. And we actually have an author workshop after this to talk about issues and stuff, so it's a very good point. But that's actually a good stopping point. We can open it up for Q&A now for about 15 minutes. So 2 rules. If you ask a question, say your name and affiliation, and also, again, please ask a question. If you talk for too long, I have to move on. So does anybody have Mike again? Since I saw you first, yeah, Mike there, sorry.
Calling the boss.
All right, yeah. Thank you, Jim, for being here.
That's fine.
Great to see you. So, all right, so let's put a federal policy question. The pension thing does seem to just overshadow all of this, right? I mean, the sense that in a lot of states, it's just going to get worse and worse and worse, and we're going to have districts spending 30, 40% of their money on this. So, how about a federal bailout for state teacher pensions?
Mike, are
Thoughts?
you running for president of the United States?
Well, right. I mean, we're into this season where we're just putting expensive things out there. Why not? Yeah.
I'll let somebody else answer. I'm not in favor.
Well,
Oh, it's meant for me? Oh. Well, let's let Joanne start. No, look, the federal government did not cause that problem. That is the consequence of many bad decisions over many years. There are mechanisms to fix it. Some states have already, like Rhode Island is a great example. A Democratic governor has set the level right. We understand. We'll see how the numbers bail out. But the idea that the federal government would step in and fix what essentially was a problem created by locals and states doesn't sit right with me. But I guess I'd be open to hearing more about it. But offhand, it doesn't sound right.
Well, I would encourage everybody to pick up last week's issue of Education Week. I wrote about this this is versus states and districts. And so the premise of the story was that pension payments are actually regressive. And in many states, they are paying as much money for pensions as they are for general education spending. And so because of that, Illinois is a prime example of this, in which they just redid their funding formula. They just said we're going to target all this billions more dollars to poor schools. And on the pension side, they are actually spending more money for wealthier districts than they are for poor districts. And so the idea being that what a lot of thinkers in Illinois are proposing is that we need to sort of throw pensions on the table the same way we throw general education spending and come up with a formula to pay pensions so that we can actually draw money from property taxes and actually spend property tax dollars to pay down pension payments. I think one of the things that there is an opportunity with education spending being in the Democratic debate, being so prominent in the Democratic debate, if a lot of these presidential candidates are saying we are going to raise teacher pay by $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, which would be billions, I would estimate trillions of dollars. That this is one of the things that they can do. Governors were talking about pensions when they were talking about teacher raises. It was one of the things that were thrown on the table. Indiana's governor said, I will pay down your pension funds to raise teacher pay. So,
Can I just build on that point? Because the problem is, we're in a situation where we want to be recruiting talented, diverse populace for becoming teachers. And new teachers are literally paying the price for this right now. It's chewing into their paychecks every week. And so every 2 weeks, month, whatever. So we really do have to get ahead of that to solve a whole slew of problems in terms of labor management.
Any other questions? Somebody who hasn't asked one yet. Brian, and then Marguerite.
Hey, Brian Hassel, Public Impact. At least start with Joanne on this one. most money flows in education on formulas, but you presided over Race to the Top, which was a competition that you asked states to be ambitious and bring plans and do something really hard and towards a big goal. Is that a tool that we should be using more at the federal or state level? If so, what did we learn from Race to the Top that could help it be more effective?
I am a fan of that policy lever. I think there are some things that do need to be given out. I think there's some money that needs to be given out on a formula basis, absolutely. I think all of the work that we do to support disadvantaged kids and special populations of kids that need more money need to get that money straight out. But I do think that there is, that there should be, am I allowed to say quid pro quo in this environment? For, like, if we're going to give you the money, you are going to make some changes that make a difference in the outcomes for the students in your community. And I think that competitions are a way to manage a lever like that, to also back to the marketplace of ideas, to get more ideas out there, shared across the community, and to see what works, to also wrap research around those and figure out which of these ideas is fruitful and has worked and which haven't, and then learn from that and move forward. So I think there's a lot of reasons that competitions can be a really powerful tool for both learning and improvement, and should be used more at the state and probably even district levels.
So to Marguerite.
So I think this is like a redo of a conference from 10 years ago, right? So that one was stretching the school dollar. This one's most the bang for the buck. And then in 10 years from now, it'll be like the smart money or something like that. Or do you think, yeah, do you think this will be different? Are you optimistic that in this next decade we'll really advance on this, or should we see you in 10 years?
So I'm optimistic only because technology is making us savvier question askers. Doesn't mean consumers. So when we start actually taking out an app, and I can see my middle daughter, Sienna, she receives X from the state, she gets this, I can ask better questions. So technology is going to force it. But I can tell you 10 years from now is really no different than 100 years from now in the past. We're saying we don't know who's in control. It was actually a book from the 70s, Who's in Control of Schools. We'll go back to TIAC and the whole part in Cuban reform over and over again. And then we'll go back to the founding of the Department of Education back in 1867, only to say there's a federal role and then to make it a cabinet level position because we have too much federal involvement. So I'm optimistic because of technology, not because of human nature.
I will also build on that. One of the fascinating things that's happening within teacher organizations or unions is that there is a lot of dialogue going on right now about school spending. Teachers are actually posting their paychecks in these social media groups. They're questioning why I'm getting paid this and you over there at that school is getting paid this. They're questioning pensions. Kentucky's entire strike was over pensions. So this idea, I think the conversation around school spending, as I pointed out before, the dynamics are changing, but I do think that people are asking smarter questions.
And I think it's being motivated by social media as opposed to unions. So it's not really a union-led movement. It's a teacher-led movement that's enabled by technology, by social media. So it's that's very different than where we've been before. I don't know what it means for 10 years from now, but it's certainly we've got some different conditions motivating things here.
Yeah. So I'd be optimistic with a couple of caveats, and the two caveats are choice and transparency. As the system becomes more and more transparent and people understand what's happening with money, how much, where it's going, I think there'll be increasing pressure, particularly on teachers whose salaries, everybody I hope in this room understand, have been absolutely flat for the last 30 years in spite of, and Brian will know the number, about 150% increase in revenue. So the teachers are not benefiting from that. So I think they themselves will start putting pressure. And then as choice and competition grows, which we believe it has been, and we believe it will continue to, that puts pressure as well on the system. So with those two conditions, I'm really optimistic. If our opponents are successful and keep school choice from expanding and keep obfuscating the data, I think we'll be exactly where we were 10 years ago.
We have time for one or two more questions. Sure, yeah, you.
Hi, Leah Cruzy, Allies for Educational Equity. Daarel, you had talked about a poll, and you were so kind of bothered and disconcerted by the responses, the variation of responses from administrators, I think, on the definition of equity. Did that poll also poll school board members? Just thinking about Secretary Duncan has talked a lot about the thousands and thousands of seats that go uncontested, and I know on average it's less than 10% turnout for school board seats. So I'm thinking of the people who actually do have control over these budgets, who are making decisions. How are they defining equity and some of the other things we're talking about here?
No, that's a good question. And so our poll was directed at administrators and principals, those who work within districts. We did not ask school board members, but one of the things that I find very fascinating is there is a dramatic change in what the student body looks like today. There is not as much of a dramatic change as to who actually sits on school boards. And so, I mean, we've tracked this in states in which you can actually look at both the racial makeup of school boards and where these school board members are coming from, and then actually like who actually has power in state. I think Ed Build actually right now was working on a report on this, in that the vast majority of power brokers at the state level who is actually keeping these outdated funding formulas in place do not look like America's student body. So what does that mean for how we are spending money?
And the issue about equity, it's worth, as we're saying, the path forward, to look backward at the language that we used in the 70s when we looked at school finance cases, whether it was Serrano v. Priest in California, Abbott in New Jersey, Rose in Tennessee, and through the 80s. We're now talking equity because at some point we've given up on equality. And we've moved from efficiency because we've somewhat really don't think effectiveness is going to work. And so 10 years from now, will equity be really equity? I don't know, but I would say go back and take a look, because we change our language in the way we think we can sue people next.
Time for one more question.
Hey, Josh Krantz from Education Week. Prior worked at the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools and a network of charter schools in Boston. My question's for Jim. Jim, I'm wondering what you actually think the charter and choice movement will contribute to this conversation. Having worked at a school before, we knew very closely where all of our dollars are going. I suspect probably because we were working with less, 71 cents on the dollar compared to traditional schools. So that's just my inclination on the transparency and how that improved our overall school. But I'm wondering what your thoughts are about how that community will help inform this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, look, the charters, you and I are often in an awkward position. I don't want to endorse every single charter school in the country. But the Boston, which network were you with? Oh, okay, so great. It's a good example of a high-performing charter school who is getting so much more out of their 70 cents on the dollar than the traditional Boston school district. So to me, that's why choice helps, because people could be looking at what the charters are doing in Boston and how they're getting so much more value out of the dollar. If we didn't have those experiments, we wouldn't be learning. We couldn't even learn anything from it. But as Joanne pointed out, we have a lot of people doing research in this country on things that don't matter. And return on investment, the return on public expenses, that should be like at the top of the list. Like, where are we getting better bang for the buck? So I see it as positive, but I'm not sure every charter school can make that argument.
It's a good stopping point, actually. That's all the time we have. Thank you for attending. Note that all the conference chapters from the authors are here, and they're on the website, so check them out. Round of applause for great panelists. Thank you.